The day I found out my trust fund was gone, my stepmother smiled, not because she felt guilty, because she thought I would never discover the truth. I was 24 years old, fresh out of graduate school, carrying 2 part-time jobs, and nearly $87,000 in student loans. My father had always told me the same thing. We couldn't afford college after your mother passed away. I'm sorry. So I believed him. I worked nights, skipped vacations, shared a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, and spent years wondering what my life might have looked like if things had been different. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, everything changed. My phone rang while I was at work. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in almost 5 years. Richard Lawson, Grandpa's attorney. I answered immediately. Hello? His voice sounded calm. Miss Carter, I need to ask you a question. Of course. Has anyone ever told you about the Harper Family Trust? I frowned. No. There was a long silence. Then he quietly replied, I was afraid you'd say that. My heart began to race. What is the Harper Family Trust? Another pause. It was created for you. I stopped breathing. What? Your grandfather established it the year you were born. I gripped the edge of my desk. There has to be some mistake. There isn't, he answered gently. The trust contained enough money to pay for your education, your first home, and provide a financial foundation for your future. I felt dizzy. If that's true, why have I never heard about it? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked another question. Is your father still married to Carol? My stepmother. Yes. I see. His voice became quieter. Then we need to meet today. 2 hours later, I sat across from Richard inside his downtown law office. He placed a thick leather folder on the table. Across the front were 5 words. Harper Family Trust File. He slowly opened it. The first page contained Grandpa's signature. The second listed me as the sole beneficiary. The third page made my blood run cold. A withdrawal history, one payment after another, college tuition, private school fees, luxury summer camps, international exchange programs, every payment, made on behalf of one person, Ethan Carter, my stepbrother, Carol's son. I looked up at Richard. There has to be a mistake. Ethan isn't Grandpa's grandson. I know, Richard replied quietly. He was never listed as a beneficiary. My hands started shaking. Then, how did he receive my money? Richard slowly closed the folder. That's exactly what your grandfather wanted us to find out. I stared at him in disbelief. What do you mean? He reached into his briefcase, removed a sealed envelope, and gently placed it in front of me. Across the front, in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, were 8 words that changed everything. Open this only after Emma learns the truth. I looked up. When did Grandpa write this? Richard answered softly. 3 weeks before he passed away. I could barely speak. So, he knew? Richard nodded. I believe he suspected something. But he never lived long enough to prove it. He pushed the envelope toward me. That's why he left this. For the day you finally discovered what happened to your trust fund. I took a deep breath, carefully broke the seal, and unfolded Grandpa's final letter. The first sentence made my heart stop. And after he remarried, Richard continued quietly, your stepmother, Carol, became the secondary contact for trust correspondence. I felt my stomach tighten. So she had access to everything? Richard nodded. She had access to the statements. But not the money. I frowned. What do you mean? The trust had very strict rules. No beneficiary changes, no unauthorized withdrawals, and no payments could be made without supporting documentation. I looked back at the payment records. Then how did Ethan receive all this money? Richard took a slow breath. That's the question your grandfather spent the last 2 years trying to answer. He reached into the folder again. This time, he placed several photocopies on the table. Do you recognize this signature? I looked closely. It was my father's. At least, it looked like my father's. The signature appeared on tuition requests, housing payments, educational reimbursements, scholarship applications. Every document authorized money from my trust, but every payment benefited Ethan. I looked at Richard. My dad signed these? I don't know, he answered honestly. I only know someone submitted them. My head was spinning. There were audits, weren't there? Every year. So no one noticed? Richard gave a sad smile. Someone noticed. Your grandfather. He opened Grandpa's journal. A yellow bookmark marked one page. Richard slid it toward me. I began reading. Emma thanked me for a secondhand laptop today. She doesn't know she has a trust fund. Why? Another entry. Carol mentioned Emma is paying for community college herself. Impossible. The trust already approved tuition. Another. Requested payment records from the bank. Something doesn't add up. Grandpa had written one sentence in bold black ink. Money leaves footprints. I smiled through my tears. That sounded exactly like him. Whenever something went missing around his workshop, he always said, "Don't look for the object. Look for the trail." Apparently, he had applied the same lesson to money. Richard leaned forward. Your grandfather didn't accuse anyone. He investigated quietly. Why didn't he tell me? Because he wanted proof. He knew accusations divide families. Evidence tells the truth. He handed me another document. At the top it read, Independent Financial Review, prepared 18 months earlier. Commissioned by Harold Carter. I looked up. He hired an investigator? Not an investigator, Richard corrected gently. A forensic accountant. Someone who follows financial records. The report was thick, nearly 80 pages. Color tabs marked different sections. Bank transfers, payment requests, correspondence, electronic approvals. Everything was organized by date. Grandpa had built a complete timeline. Then one page caught my attention. A payment request for $480,500. Purpose: Emma Carter. University tuition approved. Paid. Completed. I stared at Richard. I never received this. I know. He pointed farther down the page. The receiving account wasn't the university. It belonged to a private school. Ethan's private school. Another payment. Emma. Student housing paid. But the apartment address belonged to Ethan. Another. Emma. International semester program approved. I had never even owned a passport. The money funded Ethan's study abroad trip to Italy. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. For 12 years, someone hadn't simply taken my trust fund. They had rewritten my future. I whispered, my entire life. Richard nodded. Would have been different. I thought about the night shifts, the student loans, the apartment with leaking pipes, the vacations I never took, the career opportunities I declined because I couldn't afford unpaid internships. Every sacrifice I believed was unavoidable had been unnecessary. A tear rolled down my cheek. I kept telling myself Dad did the best he could. Richard remained silent. He knew there was nothing he could say. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding. Did my father know? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another envelope. This is why I asked you to come. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a meeting log. Date: 2 years before Grandpa passed away. Attendees: Harold Carter, Richard Lawson, David Carter, my father. I looked up. Dad met with Grandpa? Yes. What happened? Richard sighed. I can tell you. But I'd rather show you. He reached into his briefcase one last time and placed a small digital voice recorder on the table. A label was attached, in Grandpa's handwriting. Meeting with David. Play when Emma is ready. My hands froze. You recorded the meeting? Richard shook his head. No. Your grandfather did. I stared at the recorder. Somewhere inside was the conversation that could answer the question I'd carried my entire life. Was my father another victim of Carol's deception? Or had he known exactly where my trust fund had gone? Richard quietly pushed the recorder toward me. I've never listened to it. Harold instructed me to wait until today. I picked it up with trembling hands, then slowly pressed play. The recorder crackled softly. For a moment, all I heard was the sound of chairs moving across a wooden floor. Then, Grandpa's familiar voice filled Richard's office. David. Thank you for coming, my father's voice answered. I didn't have much choice. There was tension between them, the kind that only comes after years of avoiding difficult conversations. Grandpa spoke first. I've been reviewing Emma's trust. Silence. Then Dad replied, What about it? Grandpa didn't raise his voice. I want to know why my granddaughter is working 2 jobs. Another pause. Dad sighed. She's independent. Grandpa answered immediately. She shouldn't have to be. I closed my eyes. I could almost picture the room. Grandpa sitting calmly across the table. Dad refusing to make eye contact. Neither of them shouting. Neither of them willing to back down. Grandpa continued. The trust has approved tuition. It has approved housing. It has approved living expenses. So tell me, why is Emma taking out student loans? The room on the recording became silent. Finally, Dad spoke. I thought the trust wasn't large enough. Grandpa immediately replied, That's impossible. I personally funded it every year. The balance was more than enough. Another long pause followed. Then Grandpa asked the question that changed everything. David, who has been handling Emma's paperwork? Dad answered without hesitation. Carol. Richard paused the recording. He looked at me. That answer caught Harold's attention. Why? I asked. Because the trust agreement specifically required your father's signature on every major request. I frowned. So why was Carol handling it? Exactly. Richard pressed play again. Grandpa's voice returned. Have you reviewed the annual statements? Dad hesitated. Carol usually takes care of those. You never read them? I trusted my wife. The words hung heavily in the air. Grandpa sighed. Trust is valuable. But it should never replace responsibility. Paper rustled in the background. Then Grandpa spoke again. I contacted the bank last week. They sent me copies of every payment request. Dad sounded confused. Why would you do that? Because something didn't feel right. Another pause. Then Grandpa asked quietly, Do you know where Emma's tuition payments have been going? No, Dad answered. I assumed they were sent to her university. They weren't. The silence that followed lasted nearly 15 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Then, for the first time, I heard genuine shock in my father's voice. What do you mean? Grandpa replied calmly. The payments were sent to St. Andrew's Academy. Dad frowned. That's Ethan's school. Yes. And Emma has never attended it. The recording captured the sound of papers sliding across a desk. Grandpa had shown him the financial records. Dad whispered, No. There has to be some mistake. Grandpa answered firmly. I hoped there was. But I verified every payment, every account, every signature. Dad's breathing became heavier. I never authorized this. Grandpa asked one final question. Then who did? Neither man spoke, because both of them already knew the answer. The recording ended abruptly. I slowly lowered the recorder. Richard remained silent. Finally, I whispered, so Dad didn't know. Richard nodded slowly. I don't believe he knew where the money was going. But, he paused, he also failed to protect you. There was a painful difference between being innocent and being responsible. Dad may not have stolen my future, but he had signed documents he never read, ignored statements he should have checked, and trusted someone else with a duty that belonged to him. Richard opened another folder. Unfortunately, that's only the beginning. He slid a timeline across the table. Every payment from my trust had been highlighted in red. There were dozens of them. Then I noticed something unusual. The withdrawals suddenly stopped. Exactly 6 months before Grandpa died. I looked at Richard. Why? He gave a small smile. Because that's when Harold made his move. My move? Grandpa's handwritten note was clipped to the top of the timeline. The moment I confirmed the truth, I changed everything. Richard looked directly at me. Your grandfather didn't just investigate. He quietly protected what was left. And he left behind one final surprise. That Carol has no idea exists. My heart began racing again. What surprise? Richard reached into his briefcase. He carefully removed a small brass key. Attached to it was a faded tag with 4 handwritten words. Safety Deposit Box 117. He placed it in my hand. Your grandfather instructed me to open this with you. What's inside? Richard smiled. I've never seen it. But knowing Harold, I don't think it's money. I think it's the proof. I stared at the brass key in my hand. Safety Deposit Box 117. It looked ordinary, worn around the edges. Its numbers had faded over time. Yet somehow, it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. Because whatever waited inside that box, Grandpa had believed it was important enough to protect until after he was gone. Richard checked his watch. The bank closes in 90 minutes. We should leave. I nodded. Neither of us spoke during the drive. The city passed quietly outside the windows. People hurried to lunch. Children crossed busy streets. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But my entire world had already been turned upside down. 20 minutes later, we entered the oldest bank in the city. The marble floors echoed beneath our footsteps. Dark wooden counters lined the lobby. A woman in her 60s smiled at Richard. Mr. Lawson. It's been a while. He returned the smile. It has. I'm here regarding Harold Carter's safety deposit box. The manager immediately became serious. I'll prepare the documents. She disappeared through a secure doorway. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a thick folder. Miss Emma Carter? Yes. She placed several forms in front of me. I'll need your identification. And your signature. As I signed the final page, she looked at me kindly. Your grandfather visited this box every January. For almost 12 years. I looked up. He did? She smiled. Never missed a year. He always said, some promises deserve annual maintenance. My eyes filled with tears. Even now, I was still learning how carefully Grandpa had planned for my future. The manager led us through a heavy steel door, past rows of numbered vaults, past another security checkpoint. Finally, she stopped in front of a small compartment. 117. She inserted one key. Richard nodded toward me. Your turn. My hands trembled as I inserted Grandpa's brass key. The lock clicked. The drawer slowly slid forward. It was surprisingly heavy. We carried it into a private viewing room. The manager quietly closed the door behind us. For a few seconds, neither Richard nor I touched the box. Finally, he nodded. "Whenever you're ready." I lifted the lid. Inside, there wasn't any cash, no jewelry, no expensive watches. Instead, everything had been carefully organized into separate envelopes. Each one carried a handwritten label. Emma, age 18. Emma, age 21. If something happens to me. Financial evidence read last. There was also a small wooden photo frame. Inside was a picture of Grandpa and me building a birdhouse when I was 8 years old. I smiled through my tears. I remembered that day. I had accidentally hammered my own thumb. Grandpa laughed for 10 straight minutes, then bought me my first real toolbox. Richard pointed toward the envelope marked, Emma, age 18. "I think Harold intended you to open these in order." I carefully unfolded the letter. "Happy 18th birthday. Today should have been exciting. You should be preparing for college. By now, you should also know about your trust. If you don't, someone has broken a promise to me." I covered my mouth. Grandpa had written this years before, long before I ever realized anything was wrong. Another page followed. "Inside this envelope is a copy of your trust agreement. Read it carefully. No one, not even your father, has the authority to give your money to another beneficiary." Richard looked at me. "That's true. The trust was legally written to prevent exactly that." I frowned. "Then how did it happen?" He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me the envelope marked financial evidence. Inside were copies of wire transfers, trust requests, approval forms, bank confirmations. Everything looked official. Then one page caught my attention. Authorization signature. My father's name appeared at the bottom. But something looked wrong. Very wrong. I compared it with another document Richard had shown me earlier. The signatures were different. Not dramatically, just enough. The letters slanted differently. The final stroke curved the opposite direction. I looked at Richard. "These aren't the same." He nodded slowly. "No, they're not." He reached into his briefcase. This is why Harold hired a handwriting expert. He placed an independent report beside the documents. The conclusion was only one sentence. Multiple trust authorization signatures show significant signs of forgery. I stopped breathing. "Forgery?" Richard nodded. "Someone didn't simply misuse the trust. They pretended to be your father." I felt the room spin. "So Dad may never have approved any of it." "That's becoming more likely." Just then, Richard's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. His expression changed immediately. "It's your father." I frowned. "How does he know we're together?" "I don't know," he answered. "But I think you should hear this." He answered on speaker. "Richard Lawson." Dad sounded panicked. "Richard, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Did Emma contact you?" Richard remained calm. "Why are you asking?" Dad hesitated, then quietly said, "Carol just packed 2 suitcases. She said she has to leave town for a few days. She also emptied our home office." I looked at Richard. Neither of us spoke. Dad continued. "I asked her what was happening. She wouldn't answer. Then she asked me one question." Richard leaned forward. "What question?" Dad's voice became almost a whisper. "Has Richard called Emma yet?" The room fell completely silent. Carol didn't know about the safety deposit box. She didn't know about Grandpa's letters. But somehow, she already knew the truth was beginning to surface. Richard ended the call. He looked directly at me. "She's running." Before I could answer, I noticed one final envelope lying beneath the others. It was smaller than the rest. Across the front, Grandpa had written only 6 words. Open only if Carol runs. My heart pounded. I slowly picked it up. Inside was a single key, not for a bank, not for a safe. Attached to it was a handwritten tag. Storage Unit C-19. Richard looked at the key, then smiled in disbelief. I think Harold expected this exact day. I stared at Grandpa's note. Beneath the key, he had written one final sentence. If Carol runs, she's running from what's inside this storage unit. I looked at Richard. When do we go? He picked up his car keys without hesitation. Right now. Because whatever Carol was trying to escape, Grandpa had hidden the evidence years before she ever realized she would need to. Richard didn't waste another second. He picked up the storage unit key. I carefully returned Grandpa's letters to the safety deposit box, keeping only the envelopes he had instructed me to take. 5 minutes later, we were driving across town. Neither of us spoke much. Every traffic light felt too long. Every red light felt intentional. Finally, Richard broke the silence. Harold rented storage unit C-19 9 years ago. 9 years? I asked. He nodded. He renewed the lease every year, even after he became sick. He told me that if anyone ever asked about the unit, I was to say it contained old furniture. I looked at the small brass key resting in my hand. So it doesn't? Richard smiled faintly. Knowing Harold, I doubt he paid 9 years of storage fees for furniture. The storage facility sat on the edge of town. Tall chain-link fences surrounded the property. Security cameras covered every entrance. As Richard parked the car, I noticed another vehicle near Building C, a black SUV. The engine was still running. Richard followed my eyes. Do you recognize it? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The personalized license plate belonged to Carol, my stepmother. She was already here. Richard immediately pulled out his phone. Should we call the police? I asked. Not yet, he replied. If she's simply collecting her own belongings, there's nothing illegal. But if she attempts to remove property belonging to Harold's estate, that's a different matter. He quietly began recording on his phone. Let's walk. As we rounded the corner, I saw Carol standing outside Unit C-19. She looked nervous. Her hands shook as she repeatedly tried different keys. None of them worked. She muttered to herself. No. No. Come on. She never noticed us approaching. Richard spoke calmly. Looking for this? He held up Grandpa's brass key. Carol spun around. The color drained from her face. Richard, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question. She forced a smile. Harold told me there were old family keepsakes in here. I thought I'd organize them. Richard looked at her for several seconds, then quietly asked, Really? Then why did you bring 3 empty storage bins? Carol glanced toward her SUV. Inside were several large plastic containers, moving blankets, packing tape. She hadn't come to organize anything. She had come prepared to remove everything. At that moment, my father pulled into the parking lot. He jumped out of his truck, breathing heavily. Carol! She turned slowly. You followed me? I had to, he replied. You wouldn't answer my questions. He looked at the storage unit. What is this place? Carol remained silent. Dad looked at Richard. Tell me what's happening. Richard answered carefully. This storage unit belongs to Harold's estate. And according to his written instructions, it is to be opened only in Emma's presence. Dad slowly looked toward me, then back at Carol. Have you been here before? Carol hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Dad had been married to her for 15 years. He knew exactly what it meant. You have. She quietly looked away. Richard unlocked the door. The metal shutter rolled upward with a loud rattle. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. I expected old boxes, broken furniture, maybe family photographs. Instead, every shelf was filled with neatly labeled archive boxes. Each carried a year, all the way through the present. On the far wall, a large sign caught my attention. Grandpa's handwriting. Truth doesn't expire. I felt chills run down my spine. Richard walked inside. The first shelf held binders, each one labeled trust statements. Another shelf held dozens of sealed envelopes, each addressed to me. One for every birthday I had missed, one for every Christmas, one for every graduation. Grandpa had written to me every year, but I had never received a single letter. My hands began to shake. I whispered. She kept them from me. Richard carefully examined the envelopes. Everyone still carried the original postal markings. They had been returned to Grandpa. Undeliverable. Forwarding address unavailable. Recipient unavailable. I stared at the stamps. I never moved. I lived in the same apartment for 6 years. Richard nodded. I know. Someone had changed my mailing address. Dad slowly opened one of the returned envelopes. Inside, Grandpa had written, Happy 21st birthday, Emma. Your trust has paid another semester of tuition today. I hope college is everything you dreamed it would be. Dad couldn't continue reading. His hands began trembling. He looked toward Carol. She wasn't in college. Carol said nothing. Richard opened another box. Inside were copies of certified mail receipts. Every letter Grandpa had mailed, every tracking number, every delivery record. Every one had been redirected, legally, using signed change of address forms. I frowned. Can someone really do that? Richard nodded. If they claim to be an authorized household representative. He looked directly at Carol. Someone did. Carol finally spoke. I was trying to protect this family. Dad turned toward her. By stealing Emma's future? I never stole anything, she insisted. Ethan needed help. Emma was smart. I knew she'd find another way. The words echoed through the storage unit. I had spent years believing life had simply been unfair. Instead, someone had made that choice for me. Richard quietly removed another archive box. This one was different. Across the lid, Grandpa had written, Open in front of everyone. Inside was a portable hard drive, several USB flash drives, and a thick notebook. Richard opened the notebook. The first page read, If you're reading this. The paper evidence wasn't enough, so I started recording everything. I looked at him. Recording? He nodded. There may be hundreds of hours. Before anyone could speak, a loud voice echoed across the storage facility. Nobody touch those boxes! 2 uniformed detectives hurried toward us. Behind them walked the bank manager, and behind her, a middle-aged forensic accountant carrying a locked evidence case. Richard smiled. I was wondering when they'd arrive. I looked at him in surprise. You called them? He shook his head. No. Harold did. I frowned. Grandpa? Richard nodded and held up another sealed instruction from the safety deposit box. He left written instructions for today. The detective accepted the envelope, read it carefully, then looked directly at Carol. Mrs. Carter, we're going to need you to remain here while we examine the contents of this unit. Carol's confidence vanished instantly, because for the first time in 12 years, she realized she wasn't arguing with family anymore. She was facing evidence, and evidence doesn't care about excuses. The storage facility suddenly fell silent. No one touched another box. The 2 detectives carefully photographed every shelf before anything was moved. The forensic accountant introduced herself. My name is Laura Bennett. She placed a locked laptop on a folding table. I've worked with Harold Carter for almost 2 years. I looked at Richard. You knew? He nodded. Harold wanted an independent financial reconstruction. Laura smiled politely. He told me one thing. Don't tell me who you think is responsible. Show me where every dollar went. She connected an external hard drive. A detailed financial timeline appeared on the screen. 12 years. Hundreds of transactions. Every transfer from my trust fund had been traced. Colored lines connected bank accounts, payment requests, schools, vendors, and reimbursements. It looked less like a spreadsheet and more like a map. Laura pointed to the first transaction. Year 1. A request was submitted for Emma Carter's middle school enrichment program. She clicked another document. The payment was approved. Then another. The money was deposited into St. Andrew's Academy. Ethan's school, I whispered. Laura nodded. Correct. She continued. At first, the payments were relatively small. Books, uniforms, school fees, summer camps. No one questioned them, because they appeared legitimate. Then, as the trust grew, so did the withdrawals. Private tutoring, international travel, luxury boarding programs, university tuition, apartment rent, living expenses. Every expense identified me as the beneficiary, but every payment benefited Ethan. Dad looked physically ill. I signed some of those forms. Laura turned toward him. You signed a few? She clicked another file, but not most of them. The screen zoomed in on dozens of signatures. Some matched Dad's handwriting. Many didn't. A handwriting analysis appeared beside each one. Verified, questionable, not authentic. The majority were marked, not authentic. Dad slowly sat down. So, my signature was copied, Laura nodded. Repeatedly. One of the detectives stepped forward. The pattern is consistent. The same person appears to have completed the forged signatures over several years. Carol immediately interrupted. You can't prove that. The detective calmly replied. Not yet. But we're still reviewing the evidence. Laura opened another folder. This is where Harold became suspicious. A graph appeared. The trust balance should have increased every year through investment growth. Instead, there were unusual declines, then unexpected recoveries, then more withdrawals. Grandpa had highlighted every irregular movement in red. He hadn't just noticed missing money. He had noticed impossible accounting. Richard reached into one of Grandpa's archive boxes. Inside was a small digital camcorder. A note was attached. If paper isn't enough, play this. Richard inserted the memory card into a portable monitor. The date appeared, 8 years earlier. Grandpa sat in his study. Across from him was Carol. She had no idea she was being recorded. Grandpa smiled warmly. Carol, I've been reviewing Emma's trust. Carol laughed softly. Oh, Harold, you worry too much. Everything is under control. Grandpa nodded. I'm glad to hear that. He slid a folder across the table. Would you mind explaining these tuition payments? Carol barely looked at the papers. They're Emma's. Grandpa asked. Which university does she attend? Carol hesitated, then answered. I don't remember the name. Grandpa quietly smiled. That's understandable. Because she isn't enrolled anywhere. The room became silent. Carol quickly changed the subject. I'll ask David. Grandpa nodded. Please do. The video ended. The detective looked at Carol. You knew Harold had questions. She crossed her arms. I didn't remember every detail. Laura quietly responded. You remembered enough to avoid answering. Richard selected another recording. This one was dated only 3 months before Grandpa passed away. Grandpa looked much weaker, but his voice remained steady. If you're watching this, I've probably run out of time. He smiled gently. So I'll let facts finish what I started. He pointed toward the archive boxes. Every receipt, every letter, every bank record, every recording. They belong to Emma now. They're not weapons. They're protection. My eyes filled with tears. Even while fighting his illness, Grandpa had spent his remaining strength protecting me. Laura opened the final financial report. There is one more finding. The room became completely quiet. The trust wasn't completely emptied. I looked up immediately. It wasn't? She shook her head. No. Harold quietly froze the remaining assets 18 months ago. Richard smiled. I helped him, Laura continued. He also redirected future investment income into a separate protected account. Dad frowned. How much survived? Laura clicked one last file. The balance appeared on the screen. $208,469.43. I stared in disbelief. Nearly $3 million. Grandpa had managed to save what was left, before anyone else could touch it. Then Richard opened the final envelope from the storage unit. Across the front, Grandpa had written, "Open only after the money is found." Inside was one handwritten sentence. The money matters less than the lesson. Beneath it, another note. The final answer isn't in this storage unit. It's waiting inside my study. Richard looked puzzled. My study? I nodded slowly. The room Dad locked after Grandpa passed away. Richard carefully folded the letter. I think Harold left us one final piece. At that exact moment, one of the detectives stepped out of the storage unit holding a slim leather journal. I believe this belonged to Harold. The detective handed it to Richard. A ribbon marked the final written page. Richard opened it. His eyes widened. He looked at me, then quietly said, "Emma, I think your grandfather already knew who took your trust fund." I held my breath. How? Richard slowly turned the journal toward me. Across the page, in Grandpa's handwriting, were 6 unforgettable words. She confessed without realizing it. The room fell completely silent, because somewhere in Grandpa's study, there was one final piece of evidence, and according to his journal, Carol had already revealed the truth herself. She just didn't know Grandpa had preserved it. No one spoke. The words in Grandpa's journal echoed through the storage unit. She confessed without realizing it. I looked at Richard. What does that mean? He carefully closed the journal. I think Harold left one final piece of evidence, the one he believed would answer every remaining question. That evening, we drove to Grandpa's house. For months after his funeral, no one had entered his private study. Dad had locked the door exactly as Grandpa requested. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the old brass key, and unlocked it. The room smelled of cedarwood and old books. Everything remained exactly where Grandpa had left it. His reading glasses rested on the desk. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat beside his favorite fountain pen. Even his coffee mug remained on the windowsill. For a moment, it felt as if he had simply stepped outside. Richard walked directly toward Grandpa's desk. He smiled. Harold never wasted movement. If he wanted us here, he left something obvious. Dad frowned. Obvious? Richard pointed toward an antique clock sitting on the bookshelf. It stopped at exactly 4:17. So? Dad asked. So did Harold's wristwatch, Richard answered. And the clock in the workshop. And the one in the storage unit. I remembered. Every clock Grandpa owned had been frozen at the same time. 4:17. It couldn't be a coincidence. Richard carefully removed the antique clock from the shelf. Behind it, hidden inside the wall, was a small steel compartment. Dad stared in disbelief. I've lived in this house for 15 years. I never knew that was there. Richard smiled. Harold built it himself. He inserted a tiny key he had found taped beneath the clock. The compartment clicked open. Inside was a single digital recorder, one envelope, and a family photograph. The photograph showed all of us together, taken almost 13 years earlier, just weeks after Dad married Carol. Grandpa had circled one date written on the back, the same week the first trust withdrawal had been made. Richard opened the envelope. Inside was a note. If you've reached this point, then you already know what happened. Now you deserve to know why. He turned on the recorder. The date appeared. 12 years earlier, Grandpa's study. Carol sat across from him. She didn't realize the recorder was hidden inside a wooden radio on the shelf. Grandpa poured 2 cups of tea, then casually asked, "How are the children adjusting?" Carol smiled. "Ethan is doing wonderfully." "And Emma?" Grandpa asked. Carol shrugged. "Emma will be fine. She's strong." Grandpa nodded thoughtfully. Then came the question. "And the trust?" Carol answered without hesitation. "Oh, I've been using some of it for Ethan. It's really all the same family anyway." The room around me disappeared. I couldn't breathe. She had admitted it. 12 years earlier. Without hesitation. Without regret. On the recording. Grandpa remained perfectly calm. "The trust belongs to Emma." Carol laughed softly. "Does it really matter? When Ethan succeeds, we all succeed." Grandpa asked quietly, "Did David approve that?" A long silence followed. Then Carol spoke the sentence that changed everything. "He doesn't need to know every financial detail." The recorder clicked off. No one in Grandpa's study moved. Dad slowly sat down. His face had turned completely pale. He whispered, "She lied to me." For 12 years. Carol finally spoke. Her voice was barely audible. "I was trying to give Ethan the opportunities he deserved." Dad looked at her. "And Emma didn't?" She couldn't answer. Instead, she lowered her head. For the first time, there were no excuses, no explanations, only silence. Richard quietly placed Grandpa's journal on the desk. "There is one final instruction." He opened the last page. "Justice should never look like revenge. If the truth is enough, let the truth do the work." Richard smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like Harold. Over the next several months, the evidence was reviewed by the bank, insurance investigators, and the appropriate legal authorities. The forged documents, the redirected mail, the false payment requests, the recordings, the handwriting analysis. Together, they painted one complete picture. The bank acknowledged the failures in its verification process. Its insurance policy covered part of the financial loss caused by the fraudulent transactions. The remaining protected trust assets, along with years of investment growth Grandpa had preserved, were transferred into my name exactly as the trust required. I didn't receive every dollar that had been lost, but I received something even more valuable. The future Grandpa had fought to save. Dad made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold the oversized house, not because he had to, because he couldn't bear living there surrounded by 12 years of unanswered questions. He used part of his own retirement savings to establish a scholarship in my mother's name. When I asked why, he smiled sadly. "I can't erase the past, but maybe I can help someone else's future." It wasn't repayment. Nothing could repay 12 lost years. But it was accountability. Ethan eventually asked to meet me. I almost refused. Then I remembered something Grandpa used to say. Listening doesn't require agreeing. We met at a small coffee shop. He looked nervous. "I didn't know," he said immediately. "I knew Mom paid for school. I never asked where the money came from." I believed him. He had been a teenager when it started. He hadn't forged signatures. He hadn't redirected mail. He had benefited from choices someone else made. He quietly handed me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. It represented the first year's salary from his new engineering job. "I can't repay everything," he said, "but I don't want to build my future on yours anymore." I pushed half the check back toward him. "Use it to build the life you earn." We both deserve that chance. For the first time, we spoke as siblings, not rivals. 6 months later, Grandpa's workshop was alive again. Dad came every Saturday. Ethan often joined him. Richard still stopped by for coffee. We repaired old furniture, built birdhouses for neighborhood children, and laughed over Grandpa's terrible jokes written in the margins of his notebooks. One afternoon, while cleaning the workbench, I found one final folded piece of paper tucked beneath the drawer. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to whoever learns the truth. I unfolded it carefully. Grandpa had written only a few lines. "Money can be replaced. Time cannot. If this story teaches you anything, protect the people who trust you. Because once trust is stolen, even winning can't return the years that were lost." I folded the note, placed it beside Grandpa's old toolbox, and looked around the workshop. For years, I believed my greatest loss had been a trust fund. I was wrong. The greatest loss had been believing I wasn't worth investing in. Grandpa spent the final years of his life proving the opposite. Whenever someone asks me what happened to my trust fund, I don't start with the money. I start with Grandpa. Because one man refused to let the truth disappear, and in doing so, he gave me something no amount of money could ever buy: the certainty that I had been loved, protected, and never forgotten.